Before I tell you what happened that morning, know this: a quiet knock on a sleepy door can reroute an entire life. The sun was barely awake, and yet a single sentence on my porch redrew the map of our little street and the way I carry my days. Don't forget to like the video, share your thoughts or story in the comments, and subscribe to stay updated with our latest stories. Now, before I begin, tell me, where are you watching from? I'd love to know which cities and towns are joining me for this memory that stayed with me for years. It was the hour when the dew still clung to the lavender by my steps, and the sparrows argued like neighbors over a fence. I had the kettle on, the window cracked, and a dish towel slung over my shoulder, the way my mother used to wear it. Our block was a quilt of small houses, peeling paint here, a brave rosebush there, and the narrow lane that gathered our lives like thread. When the knock came, a few soft taps, I almost thought I imagined it. People don't visit at dawn unless the news is heavy or the heart is. I opened the door, and there stood Aaron, my neighbor's son, taller than the gate he used to cling to, shoulders squared, as if he practiced in a mirror. He was holding a thermos like a shield and staring at the wood of my porch instead of my face. I knew him as the kid who mowed lawns on Saturdays and tossed a football down the street with a careful arc, the boy who always waved but never lingered. The air smelled like wet earth and lip of lemon from the tea I just set to steep. "Can we talk?" he asked, voice steady in the way a branch is steady right before wind tests it. I stepped aside and let him in. The house carried that soft morning hush. Tick of the wall clock, kettle beginning to murmur, distant hum of a bus on Riverside. I poured him tea, and he wrapped both hands around the mug the way cold fingers find a campfire. He didn't drink. He just held the warmth like he was gathering his courage from it. "I don't want to make a mess," he said. But I think I already did. He looked older in my kitchen light, the way daylight makes you admit you forgot to sleep. I waited, because waiting is what grown women learn to do. You learn it in doctors' offices and school assemblies, and at side doors where bad news sometimes lives. I took a breath and stood with my back against the counter, letting him paint the first line of whatever picture he brought. "It's about Mom," he said finally. "And me, I guess. And how I'm not sure how to carry what I tried to carry." The kettle clicked off as if on cue. I poured more hot water to keep the room from feeling empty. He told me he'd been working the night shift at the warehouse for weeks without telling his mother, saving for the rent that had jumped like a startled deer. He said he'd been skipping first period some days, sleeping on the back of the bus, finishing assignments by the light of a phone screen. He said his mom would be furious if she knew, but he had been watching the overdue notices stack up like autumn leaves no one raked. "I thought if I could hold it long enough," he said, "it wouldn't fall on her." His voice shook just once. "But now it's falling on me, and I don't know how to tell her I'm not as strong as I wanted to be." That was the thing I never expected from him. Not trouble, not defiance, but the honesty of a young man standing at the edge of his limits and saying he needed another pair of hands. He told me the landlord had come by the night before, towing the step, clearing his throat, talking in those polite phrases that aren't really polite at all. He'd watched his mother smile and nod and promise things she didn't have, and he'd made a decision that scared him, to ask for help out loud. "Why me?" I asked, not to push him away, but to make room for his reason. "Because you notice things," he said, looking up at last. "You noticed when my mom stopped planting marigolds. You noticed when I stopped throwing the ball. You notice, and you don't make a big speech about it. You just set out tea." We sat there with the steam rising like thin ghosts. He reached into his backpack and pulled out a bent envelope, the kind you keep in a drawer for too long. Inside was a flyer from a community clinic, the hours circled, and a handwritten note with numbers, charities and agencies, scribbled like a map drawn at midnight. He gathered resources the way a person gathers, kindling, careful, and a little desperate. "I don't want to rescue," he said. "I want a plan, and I want my mom to still see me as her kid, not her shield." There was a quiet that felt like respect, the kind that fits two people like a shared coat. I told him we would make a plan, one with steps you could count on 10 fingers and tape to a refrigerator. Call this number. Talk to that counselor. Arrange a payment schedule that didn't steal sleep. Tell his mother everything. Together, so the truth didn't land like a brick, but like a key turning. Outside, the light strengthened, and the sparrows fell into ordinary chirping. I slid the plate of toast between us, and we ate like travelers about to cross a long bridge. He smiled for the first time, small and real, and I felt something settle in me, the way a picture finally hangs straight after leaning for years. "Thank you," he said, standing to go. This was the hardest door to knock on. "It won't be the hardest conversation," I told him. Hard things get easier when they're shared. When he stepped back onto the porch, the lavender brushed his jeans and left a bright smell that followed him down the walk. I watched him go with his backpack lighter by the way to a secret, and my kitchen felt less like a room and more like a starting line. I didn't know yet how the day would unfold, only that a morning had arrived carrying a young man's honesty, and I had been asked to hold one end of it steady. The morning after Aaron's visit, I found myself lingering over the same patch of counter where his mug had rested, the circle it left faint as a watermark. It was strange how a single conversation could make you see your own kitchen differently, like someone had shifted the curtains just enough to let in a new kind of light. I kept replaying his words in my mind, his fear of being the shield instead of the sun, and it reminded me of how easily burdens grow heavier when carried alone. Later that afternoon, I heard a knock again, softer this time, almost uncertain. When I opened the door, Aaron stood there, eyes rimmed with a tiredness that seemed older than his years, though he had tucked his shirt in as if dressing for courage. This time, he wasn't holding a thermos. He had a folder tucked under his arm, one I recognized from the community center, the kind they hand out at job fairs and counseling offices. He had been busy since our talk. "I don't know if I can do this without you," he said, holding the folder out like an offering. "Mom will be home in an hour. I think it's time." I felt something shift in me then, a mix of nerves and tenderness. It had been years since I'd stood beside someone in a truth-telling moment, the kind where silence could either heal or wound. I remembered my own younger days, holding my breath as I told my father about mistakes I couldn't undo, how the pause before his reply had felt like an eternity. Sometimes the right witness in the room can soften the blow. When his mother came through the door, arms loaded with grocery bags and her face etched with the usual fatigue, I caught her eye and gave a small nod. She looked puzzled at first. Why was her son in my kitchen, folder open on the table, papers fanned like fragile wings? But as Aaron began to speak, her expression changed in waves. Surprise, worry, hurt, then something gentler, as if she was realizing she wasn't being confronted, but invited into the truth. He explained everything, the late shifts, the school he'd been skipping, the envelopes piling up in the drawer. He didn't cry, but his voice wavered, and that made her blink fast as if holding back her own storm. "I didn't want you to think I was weak," he said. "I just didn't want to see you bend under it all." She set the grocery bags down, bread nearly falling out, and reached across the table to cover his hands with hers. "Aaron," she whispered, "you're my boy. You don't have to hold the roof up by yourself." The room went quiet again, but this time it wasn't heavy. It was the kind of quiet that comes when the truth has finally landed and found a chair. I sat back and let them talk, their voices filling the space where worry used to sit. Plans were made. Phone calls tomorrow. A meeting at the community office. A clear explanation to the school. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was the kind of plan you could walk on without falling through. When they finally left, Erin glanced back at me with a small smile, a thank you that didn't need words. I closed the door slowly, listening to their voices fading down the street, and I realized something I hadn't expected either. Sometimes being the neighbor who notices is enough to help a family remember they're not alone. I don't want a rescue, he said. I want a plan. And I want my mom to still see me as her kid, not her shield. There was a quiet that felt like respect, the kind that fits two people like a shared coat. I told him we would make a plan, one with steps you could count on 10 fingers and tape to a refrigerator. Call this number. Talk to that counselor. Arrange a payment schedule that didn't steal sleep. Tell his mother everything, together, so the truth didn't land like a brick, but like a key turning. Outside, the light strengthened, and the sparrows fell into ordinary chirping. I slid the plate of toast between us, and we ate like travelers about to cross a long bridge. He smiled for the first time, small and real, and I felt something settle in me, the way a picture finally hangs straight after leaning for years. Thank you, he said, standing to go. This was the hardest door to knock on. It won't be the hardest conversation, I told him. Hard things get easier when they're shared. When he stepped back onto the porch, the lavender brushed his jeans and left a bright smell that followed him down the walk. I watched him go with his backpack lighter by the weight of a secret, and my kitchen felt less like a room and more like a starting line. I didn't know yet how the day would unfold, only that a morning had arrived carrying a young man's honesty, and I had been asked to hold one end of it steady. The days that followed felt lighter, though not easy. I would see Erin in the mornings, walking to school with a backpack that no longer sagged like it was filled with bricks. He still looked tired, but it was a different kind of tired, the kind that comes from effort, not from secrecy. His mother had planted a small row of marigolds by the porch again, bright orange dots against the soil, and every time I passed their house I felt a quiet kind of pride. It wasn't my home, but somehow their healing felt shared. One evening, I was sitting on my porch with a blanket wrapped around my shoulders when Erin walked up, hands shoved deep in his jacket pockets. He didn't look troubled, more thoughtful, as if turning over something he wasn't sure how to say. He sat on the step below me, looking out at the street where the lampposts had just flickered to life. I told one of my teachers what was going on, he said. I thought she'd be angry about me missing class, but she just listened. She said I was stronger than I realized. I don't think I believed her until she said it. I nodded, letting him speak at his own pace. There was a steadiness in his voice now, like someone learning to balance on a rope they used to fear. He talked about how his mother had gone with him to the community center, how they'd met with someone who explained programs to help with rent, how she'd squeezed his hand under the table like a signal of pride instead of worry. For the first time in weeks, he said, he'd seen her laugh, really laugh, over something silly on the television. I didn't know, he confessed quietly, that sharing what I carried could actually make me feel bigger, not smaller. That sentence stayed with me long after he left that night. I thought about the times in my own life when I had hidden my troubles, trying to keep my children or friends from worrying, only to find the silence heavier than the problem itself. Watching Erin discover that truth at his age felt like witnessing a seed sprouting right before my eyes. Over the next weeks, I noticed changes in him. He started helping his mother with the garden, kneeling in the soil to pull weeds while she pointed out where to plant. On Saturdays, he still mowed lawns, but now he did it with a kind of purpose, like he knew he wasn't just earning money. He was contributing to something steady. Even the way he carried himself on the sidewalk was different, shoulders not quite so heavy. his steps matching the rhythm of someone moving forward. But not everything was simple. One morning, he knocked again, and when I opened the door, I saw the same tension on his face I'd seen the first time. He explained that the landlord had been by again, this time with a more serious tone. The help from the center would cover part of what was owed, but not all of it. He was afraid his mother would crumble under the thought of losing their home. His voice shook when he admitted, "I don't want her to think all this work was for nothing." I invited him in, poured tea, and listened. The truth was, I didn't have a magic answer. What I did have was the certainty that sometimes the greatest gift is not fixing everything, but reminding someone they don't have to face it alone. So we talked through ideas, extra shifts at the center, possible odd jobs, even the church down the street that sometimes helped families in tight spots. I promised to make a few calls, and his relief was so visible it made my own chest loosen. As he left, I noticed the marigolds swaying in the evening breeze, a small reminder that even fragile things can stand tall again once planted in the right soil. Watching Aaron walk down the street that night, I realized his journey wasn't about being rescued. It was about learning that strength is found in leaning, in trusting, in building bridges where once there were only walls of silence. And though I had not expected it, I found myself learning the same lesson right alongside him. The last time Aaron knocked on my door, it wasn't with worry etched across his brow or exhaustion in his shoulders. It was a Saturday morning, the kind where the air smells faintly of cut grass and children's laughter drifts from somewhere down the block. I opened the door to find him standing there with a paper bag in his hands and a grin that belonged more to a boy than to the burdened young man I had first welcomed in weeks ago. "Mom baked muffins," he said, holding the bag out. "She said we owe you more than thanks, but this is a start." I laughed, surprised by the warmth of the gesture, and invited him in. We sat at the kitchen table where so much had been said, crumbs scattering as we unwrapped the muffins. He looked around the room, and I could tell he remembered those mornings when he could barely speak, when fear pressed at his throat. Now he seemed lighter, as though some invisible weight had finally slid off his back. "We had the meeting with the landlord," he told me between bites. "It wasn't easy, but we explained everything, the program, the help we're getting, and what we could realistically pay. He agreed to give us more time. I think Mom almost cried, but she held herself steady. And afterward," he paused, smiling at the memory, "she hugged me like I hadn't felt in years. She said she was proud." Those words seemed to fill the room, settling like sunlight in corners that had once felt dark. For Aaron, pride wasn't just about grades or jobs anymore. It was about honesty, resilience, and learning the hard truth that asking for help isn't weakness. For his mother, it was the recognition that her son wasn't just her child, but her partner in keeping their lives steady. And for me, it was the quiet satisfaction of being allowed into their story, if only as a witness and a steady presence. As the weeks passed, I began to see small ripples of change. Aaron waved at me from across the street with confidence. His mother tended to the marigolds, now blooming fuller, brighter, as if fed by something more than soil and water. And on the days when I walked past their porch, I could hear laughter inside. A sound that once felt rare, now returning like a familiar song. One evening, sitting with my tea as twilight settled, I reflected on all of it. It struck me how unexpected life's turning points can be. A knock on the door, a folded flyer, a boy's trembling voice in the early morning hours. Those moments can arrive quietly, disguised as ordinary, and yet they reshape the way we see one another and ourselves. I had opened my door to Aaron, but what I truly opened was a space where honesty could rest, where burdens could be shared, where strength could be redefined. Looking back, I realized that story didn't just belong to him or his mother. It belonged to all of us who sometimes think we must carry life alone. And though I hadn't planned on it, his courage had reminded me of something I had long forgotten, that even in the smallest neighborhoods, even in kitchens warmed only by tea and quiet words, we can find proof that connection still matters. That morning, when Aaron first stood on my porch, I never expected the truth he would share. But I know now that moments like these are the threads that hold our lives together. And as I watched him grow steadier with each passing day, I found myself grateful, not only for the chance to help, but for the lesson he gave me in return. That strength isn't measured by how much we endure alone, but by how bravely we open the door when someone knocks.